Thanks. Really glad to be with you. It's actually a great privilege to be able to take part in this commemoration of the achievement, 50 years of achievement, difficult times. The voice of Canadian Dimensions becomes more valuable, more significant with each passing year, and I think I'm sure we'll continue to do so. What I'd like to discuss the world system that's taking shape right now, very lively topic today, rightly so. The discussion and debate in the leading journals of international affairs provides essential insight into how the issues are viewed in high places where decisions are made. There is a central theme. It's called sometimes America's decline, as power continues its long shift over the centuries from its Mediterranean, Middle East origins to Northwest Europe, then to their offshoots across the seas, then across the Pacific, what's happening now, to the rising giants, India and China, which had indeed been the leading industrial and commercial powers before Europe's industrial revolution and imperial expansion. Typical illustration of the prevailing theme is a recent year-end issue of the most prestigious of U.S. establishment journals, Foreign Affairs, Journal of Council on Foreign Relations. Take a look at the front cover, bold face, oversized letter. It reads, "Is America over?" The lead article, several articles, the lead article calls for retrenchment, I'm quoting it, retrenchment in the humanitarian missions abroad that are consuming the country's wealth. That's so as to arrest America's decline and to impede the inexorable shift of power to China and India. Now, there's a contrasting view a couple of months later in the same journal, also in Harvard University's journal, International Security, sort of the gold standard in the field, scholarship. And these contributions set the bounds for, much of the bounds for mainstream discourse. They all share considerable common ground. They take it for granted. They all share the a conception that's called American exceptionalism. That is, that the United States is unique in history in its benevolence and its commitment to all good things. It's a contribution that the world desperately needs, and if the U.S. doesn't provide it, the whole world's going to be in trouble. That's current debate. Actually, there was a gloss on that by a British diplomat in the late 1940s when Britain was ruefully considering the fact that it was no longer going to be the dominant global power, but it would be what the Foreign Office called a junior partner to its to the big guy across the seas, the United States. And the diplomat pointed out that the United States assures the world that we can provide what you need and what you want and what you're going to get, whether you want it or not. That's more accurate than the official version. If you take the two opposite extremes that I was discussing, the one that calls for retrenchment, the one that says, no, we better not because the world needs us too badly, there are specific things that they take for granted, and they're worth thinking about. I'll quote them. They both take for granted that after the United States became the hegemonic power in the global system, the system that arose from the ashes of World War II, replacing Britain, since then its policies have had certain constants. One of them, the main one, is the effort to advance core interests in security, prosperity, and domestic liberties. Also common ground is the assumption that, quote, during the Cold War, this commitment served primarily to prevent the encroachment of Soviet power into regions containing the world's wealthiest, potentially most powerful, most resource-rich states. And therefore, force and subversion are automatically justified in self-defense. We've all heard this hundreds of times. And in fact, disagreement on these basic doctrines is so slight that it's considered unnecessary even to provide evidence or to consider alternative views, just as you don't trouble to refute the belief that the earth is flat. There's some things too absurd to waste time on. Well, there are those, like Canadian Dimensions, who are willing to step outside the framework of rigid dogma of the political class, the media, the mainstream intellectual community. And when you do, it's not difficult to come up with some pretty obvious questions. So, for example, one question is it true that containing Soviet power was the primary goal of the United States during the Cold War, so that the actions undertaken are in fact in self-defense? For example, the action of invading and virtually destroying Indochina is the major crime of the post-World War II period, or carrying out a brutal, bitter terrorist war and economic strangulation of Cuba for half a century, still going on, or a long list of other crimes that there's no time to review and that should be familiar. Well, there is actually ample evidence about all these matters, even from the internal planning record, which we have considerable access to. There's a rich store of declassified sources that explains very clearly the motives of planners. And they reveal very clearly that in Indochina, in Cuba, Iran, Guatemala, numerous other cases, concerns had virtually nothing to do with Soviet power, though it was, of course, also always invoked to frighten the population here into obedience. The concern was what was called the domino theory. There's a good paraphrase of it by Henry Kissinger. He points out that, correctly in fact, that a region that drifts out of control is a virus that can spread contagion and might induce others to follow the same path. That doctrine, we've got to kill the virus, prevent the spread of contagion. That actually is an authentic constant of U.S. grand strategy. It's as old as the history of imperialism. It's familiar in many other contexts. The mafia, for example, the Godfather cannot permit a small storekeeper not to pay protection money because that virus might spread to others, and pretty soon the system of domination might erode. In fact, this mafia doctrine is probably the leading principle of international affairs. The domino theory, that's not a joke, incidentally. The domino theory is commonly ridiculed when the dominoes don't fall, but it remains a leading principle of policy, actually never challenged in actual policy. And there's a good reason for that. It's perfectly rational. The violent implementation of the theory is what keeps the dominoes upright. So yes, it's the right policy to pursue. In the case of Vietnam, we have a rich record. We know what the concern was. The concern, not the Russians, it was the virus, to borrow Kissinger's terms, the virus of independent development, which it was thought might infect surrounding countries. Crucially, Indonesia, this country they were really worried about, really does have rich resources, unlike Indochina, which was of no special importance in itself. Actually, it was feared that in the late 1940s, early 50s, that the infection might reach Japan. It was called the super domino by prominent Asia historian John Dower. The concern was that Japan might accommodate to an independent Asia as its technological and industrial center. That would be a system that would escape the reach of U.S. power. If you think about it, that would mean that, in effect, the United States would have lost the Pacific War, the Pacific phase of World War II, which was fought largely to prevent Japan's attempt to establish what it called a new order in Asia. And these concerns were not alleviated until the Vietnamese virus was eradicated and the region was inoculated from infection by the obvious means, brutal tyrannies established in country after country with U.S. support. And that achievement was understood. Years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was National Security Advisor under Kennedy and Johnson, they reflected about the Indochina Wars, and he concluded that it might have been wise to end the war in Vietnam in 1965. Why 65? Because in that year, a military-backed, U.S.-backed military coup in Indonesia installed a murderous dictatorship, slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, destroyed the only functioning mass political party, blocking the threat of democratization, and crucially it opened Indonesia's resources to Western corporations. And at that point, it was really pointless to continue the war in Vietnam. South Vietnam had been practically wiped out. The dominoes weren't going to fall. They were all protected from infection, including, crucially, Indonesia. And similar achievements throughout the region did end the perceived threat. The Russians had virtually nothing to do with it. The case of Cuba was pretty much the same. And again, we know it from the declassified internal record. I'll quote, the concern from the very beginning was that the Cuban example might encourage others to take matters into their own hands, an idea with great appeal throughout the continent because the distribution of land and other forms of national wealth greatly favors the propertied classes and the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution and now demanding opportunities for a decent living. That was Arthur Schlesinger, liberal historian, who was John F. Kennedy's close advisor and was in charge of the Latin American mission that Kennedy established as he was coming into office to give an assessment of concerns in Latin America. And that was the concern of Cuba. Go on with the internal record. It reveals that the basic concern was, I'll quote again, the very existence of the Castro regime represents a successful defiance of the United States, a negation of our whole hemispheric policy of almost a century and a half. No Russians, referring to the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, which declared the U.S. intention to control the hemisphere. Couldn't be achieved at the time. Britain was too powerful, but later it was achieved as British power declined and U.S. power continued. And that's the Mafia doctrine, pure and simple. That's 50 years of torture of Cuba still continuing. Around the same time, early 60s, distinguished statesman Dean Acheson, he's one of the creators of the modern world order, he informed the American Society of International Law that the United States would not tolerate a challenge to its power, position, and prestige, so that legal issues do not arise when the U.S. attacks on Cuba violate international law. In brief, again, no Russians, except insofar as they impeded U.S. objectives to reestablish control and prevent the virus from spreading contagion. And throughout Latin America, as in Asia in the same years, appearance of the virus led to policies to establish murderous tyrannies throughout the region. It's the worst plague of repression in the history of Latin America since the European conquests. Actually, Acheson's basic thesis remains alive. It was just restated a couple of weeks ago by Secretary of State John Kerry. Received little notice, but worth thinking about. This was right after the kidnapping of al-Libi in Tripoli, capital of Libya. The U.S. Special Forces invaded Libya, kidnapped a terrorist suspect, al-Libi. Kerry happened to be in Indonesia at the time at a conference, and he was asked in a press conference whether it was legal to invade another country and kidnap somebody that you want and take him out and put him on a Navy ship to be interrogated for a couple of weeks without a lawyer. And Kerry pointed out quite accurately that it is legal. It's in conformity with U.S. law, which is correct. It is in conformity with U.S. law, even Supreme Court rulings. So that makes it legal. Legal is one thing, justifiable is another. We all know that a principle, a legal or moral principle, is justified if it can be generalized, otherwise not. So it would be legal if, in fact, say, Cuba was entitled to send special forces to Miami to kidnap Luis Posada Carriles, or before him, Orlando Bosch, serious confirmed terrorists, not suspects. Well, don't have to comment on that. What Kerry is saying just a couple of weeks ago, what Acheson said a couple of decades ago, many others have said, is simply that the United States is a rogue state. It owns the world by right. It acts in the manner of the Godfather, who owns his domains by right. The striking fact is that Kerry's statement was reported, so you can read it in the back pages of the newspapers, elicited no detectable comment. That reflects the very wide acceptance of the doctrine. You can tell me whether there was any comment here. I suspect not. We find the same case by case right throughout the Cold War. And in fact, it's very striking that as the Cold War ended, Washington obliquely conceded that the alleged Russian threat was not a crucial part, in fact, almost any part of the Cold War. The reason was after the Soviet Union collapsed, you could no longer invoke it to justify policies. And for people who want to understand the nature of the Cold War, that's most of the Cold War era, that's the obvious place to look. Take a look and see how policy was affected by the end of the conflict. That's simple rationality. And we know it was public, not even secret documents. That was, at the time, the first Bush administration was in office. They quickly issued a new national security strategy, reflected the realities of the post-Cold War era. And there was a basic message. The message was that nothing essential would change apart from new pretexts. So it would still be necessary to have a huge military establishment, not because of the Russian hordes, because they're not around anymore, but because of what they called the technological sophistication of third world powers. Now, if you're well educated, you're not supposed to laugh when you hear that. And if you look, you find people didn't laugh. They nodded soberly. The strategy also stated that it would be necessary to maintain what they called the defense industrial base. The defense industrial base is a euphemism for high-tech industry, which has to be sustained by government power, usually under the Pentagon cover, for the benefit of corporate profits and what's called the health of the economy. So that has to be maintained, although you can't call it defense against the Russians anymore. Particularly interesting was what they said about the Middle East. They said the strategy said it would be necessary to maintain powerful intervention forces targeting the Middle East, resource-rich area, And there it said the significant threats to U.S. interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door, as had been claimed for 50 years. So in short, sorry, folks, we've been lying to you all along, but now we must concede that the threats to U.S. interests had to do with what's called radical nationalism, that is, independent nationalism, very much as in the case of Vietnam, Cuba, Iran, in fact, throughout most of the world. More generally, a very good case can be made that the Cold War from its origins was basically a war by each of the superpowers against efforts to achieve independence in its own domains. For Russia, that meant Eastern Europe, the traditional invasion route. For the United States, meant most of the rest of the world. That's pretty well supported by very well supported by the historical and documentary record, but such ideas are excluded from polite discourse, excluded from consideration. They're not condemned. They're just unthinkable. And very similar questions arise when you look at the other alleged constants. So take the core interest in domestic prosperity. Obvious question, whose prosperity? Since the 1970s, that's about half the period under review, policies have been carefully designed to enrich a tiny segment of the population, fraction of 1%, while for the majority, incomes have stagnated, declined. And the word designed is quite accurate. Actually, these neoliberal policies are reviewed in a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. That's the main source, the main source of reliable economic data on these developments for many years. The document of the study is called Failure by Design. By design, recognizing that other choices have always been possible. And as the study points out, the failure is class-based. There's no failure for the designers. They're doing great. Rather, the policies are a failure for the large majority of the population. It's a very serious problem for working people and the middle classes. It's a real disaster for the most oppressed. So African Americans, who incidentally have never escaped the legacy of slavery and its ugly aftermath, their meager wealth virtually disappeared after the collapse of the housing bubble in 2008. It's what set off the recent financial crisis, the worst one so far, worse likely to come, as the system that has led to the regular crises is being reconstituted. It's worth remembering that the financial crises are a property of the neoliberal order. In the 50s and the 60s, there weren't any. The New Deal regulations were in place. As they began to be dismantled under neoliberalism, you get crisis after crisis, each one worse than the last. The public called upon to bail out the perpetrators time after time, as just happened. And the neoliberal policies, so-called Washington consensus, have had similar effects worldwide. And actually resistance to them, which is now significant, has been a major part of the challenge to the post-war global order in recent years. The power of established doctrine in the face of massive counter-evidence is extremely interesting. It provides useful insight into constraints on freedom of thought in very free societies, restriction of expression without state violence, which is a pretty interesting essay on this by George Orwell, not very well known. It was written as the introduction to his famous book, Animal Farm, but it's unknown because it was unpublished. It was discovered 30 years later in his unpublished papers. The introduction is devoted to what he calls literary censorship in England. The book itself, as you all know, is a satire on the totalitarian enemy. But in the unpublished introduction, Orwell comments to the British readers that they shouldn't feel that self-satisfied because England is not that different. In free England, he says, ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. He doesn't say much about the mechanisms, a couple of sentences, but they're to the point. The first one is that, as he puts it, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every reason to want certain ideas to be suppressed. But the second reason, a much more interesting one, is a good education. If you've gone to the good schools, Eton, Harrow, Oxford, Cambridge, we have our parallels, if you had a good education, you've internalized the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say, and we should add, even to think. That's an insight that should be taken quite seriously and pursued. Occasionally, there's some recognition of these intriguing phenomena. The great American humorist and political critic Mark Twain once observed that it's by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. That's pretty accurate. There's also occasional notice of this in serious scholarship in interesting ways. One case, particular interest, is Hans Morgenthau. He's the founder of the dominant, hard-headed, no sentimentality, realist school of international relations. And to his credit, he's one of the very few to condemn what he called our conformist subservience to those in power, speaking of the intellectual community. In the early 1960s, you recall that there was a lot of exuberance about the Camelot years, kind of similar to the exuberance when Obama was elected, very short-lived, too long, but short. During that period, the Camelot image has remained, partly because Kennedy was assassinated, so everyone forgets what actually happened, but it's not dissimilar. Morgenthau, at that time, wrote a book called The Purpose of America, and the book extolled the prevailing doctrine called American exceptionalism, which holds, as I said, that the U.S. is unlike other great powers because it's guided by what Morgenthau called a transcendent purpose to uphold equality and freedom in the United States and throughout the world. Now, Morgenthau was an honest and competent scholar, and he recognized that the historical record is radically inconsistent with America's transcendent purpose. But he explains that we should not let that mislead us. Rather, we should not, I'm quoting him, we should not confound the abuse of reality with reality itself. Reality itself is the unachieved national purpose, revealed by the evidence of history as our minds reflect it. The actual historical record is abuse of reality, which is only of secondary interest. And he goes on to say that those who confound reality with abuse of reality are committing the error of atheism, which denies the validity of religion on similar grounds. And it's an apt analogy, though not exactly in the manner he intended. The reigning doctrines can appropriately be regarded as a secular religion. It differs from other religious commitments in a number of ways. One of them is that it is so deeply entrenched that it's invisible. Believers in, say, evangelical Christianity are aware that they have religious beliefs, but not if you are a believer in the secular religion, you've had a good education. then it's kind of like the air you breathe. There's no conceivable alternative. This is quite unlike medieval theology. If you read medieval theology, you find very interesting discussions of heresy. Thomas Aquinas and others felt that it was critically important to refute heresy. But for the secular religion, refutation is not even necessary. If necessary at all, it can be a few derisive remarks about the loony left or something like that. The transcendent purpose that Morgenthau attributed to the United States is often called Wilsonian idealism. And Wilson's public discourse, it was in fact idealistic, but not in practice. In practice, he was one of the most brutal and destructive interventionists, and his famous concept of self-determination was quite sharply restricted. It excluded those who he called, those who in his words were at a low level of civilization, those in the colonies. They, he said, must be given friendly protection, guidance, and assistance by the colonial powers that had hitherto cared for them with such tenderness. His Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, understood the doctrine very well, referring to policies and official discourse concerning Latin America. Lansing pointed out that the idealistic flourishes were just a rhetorical cover. Policies, he said, are based on selfishness alone. The United States considers its own interests. The integrity of other American nations is an incident, not an end. And Wilson, in fact, agreed, but he advised that it would be impolitic to say this publicly. The public have no right to know what's none of their business, the abuse of reality, actual history. Well, let's turn from the interesting topic of doctrinal constraints on freedom of thought, which is, I think, quite valuable to consider. Let's turn from that and look at what Morgenthau called the abuse of reality. That is what actually happens in the world. Well, the United States is, one of the great virtues of the United States is that it's an unusually free country, and we have easy access to rich internal records, so those who want to learn something about planning can easily find out. There's no shortage of information about how plans were implemented. If it's not used, it's, again, the results of a good education. You're not supposed to look, but you can find out. So let's look at the American decline. The American decline that now elicits such concern. It does play an important role in the emerging world order. But it's worth remembering that it's not a recent phenomenon. It traces back 75 years to the end of the Second World War. In 1945, the United States reached the absolute peak of its power. In fact, power without any precedent in world history. Other industrial societies had been destroyed or severely weakened. The United States gained enormously from the war. Depression was ended by government spending, industrial production almost quadrupled. At that point, the United States had half the entire wealth of the world, incomparable security, global reach, nothing like that in history. And planners were well aware of it. They recognized the enormous disparity of power, as they called it, between the United States and other countries, and they intended to keep it that way, not surprisingly. They developed elaborate plans for world order. Each region was assigned its function within the global system that was supposed to be organized by U.S. power. And the idea was that the U.S. would control the Western Hemisphere as a matter of course. It would also control the entire Far East, the former British Empire. Britain would become a junior partner, including, of course, the Middle East, and as much of Eurasia as possible, but at a minimum, the commercial and industrial centers, Western, Central Europe. These early post-war policies were not unrealistic, given the distribution of power, so it made good sense to pursue them. But decline set in at once. In 1949, China declared independence. That event is known in the United States and Western discourse generally. It's known as the loss of China. In the United States, there are bitter recriminations. There's conflict about who was responsible for the loss. That's a good part of what lay behind McCarthyism. And the terminology is quite revealing, loss of China. It's only possible to lose something that you own. Like, I can't lose your cell phone. I can lose my cell phone, but I can't lose yours. But we lost China, and the question is, who's responsible for it? There's a tacit assumption. The United States owns China by right, and it owns most of the rest of the world, just as post-war planners assumed. And when Kerry recently says that invading another country and kidnapping people is legal by American law and therefore legal, he's essentially saying the same thing, and no comment on it. The loss of China was a major step in America's decline, a very major step, and it had major policy consequences immediately. One policy consequence was the decision to support France's effort to reconquer its former colony in Indochina, so that Indochina would not be lost. And as I mentioned, there's good reasons for that. The rational choice, as I mentioned, was to destroy the virus of potential successful development, independent development in Indochina, and to inoculate the rest of the region with brutal dictatorships. And those tasks were quite successfully carried out, although history has its own cunning, and something similar to what was feared has since been developing in East Asia, much to Washington's dismay. Well, despite many victories in destroying viruses and maintaining control, American decline continued. By the early 1970s, the U.S. share of world wealth had declined to about 25%, roughly where it remains now. That's still colossal, but it's not 50%, far below the end of World War II. By then, the industrial world was what was called tripolar, had three major economic centers: North America, based in the United States, German-based Europe, and Northeast Asia, already the most dynamic industrial region of the world by the early 70s. At the time, it was Japan-based, and now it includes the former Japanese colonies, Taiwan and South Korea, and more recently, China. Well, at about that time, American decline entered into a new phase, a phase of conscious, self-inflicted decline. Now, that's the failure by design that I already mentioned. The economy was shifted radically towards financialization, production sent abroad. Great success for the masters, not for the population, and harmful to the economy and society generally. Wealth concentrated within, that almost reflexively leads to a concentration of political power. That leads to legislation which carries the vicious cycle forward. That's what's been going on for the last generation, particularly under Reagan, and also his successors. Well, as is pretty well known, you all know, the neoliberal assault on the general population has concentrated extraordinary wealth in the hands of literally a fraction of 1% of the population. For the large majority, incomes have stagnated or declined. The political influence goes along with it. You take a look at the mainstream academic political science in the United States. One of the main topics of studies is the relation between policy and opinions. Policy you can see, opinions you know pretty well because of careful, extensive polling. And so you can compare the two. And there's a huge gap between policy and opinion on crucial issues. The marginalization of the public has become so extreme that for roughly 70% of the population, the lower 70% on the income wealth scale, they literally have no influence on policy. Political leaders just pay no attention to them. And significant influence is concentrated at the very peak of the radically unequal income pyramid. Well, meanwhile, losses continue to mount elsewhere. Past decade has been quite spectacular in that respect. In the last decade, for the first time in 500 years, South America has taken successful steps to free itself from Western domination. That's a development of truly historic importance and a very serious blow to U.S. imperial power. The region had suffered severely from neoliberal policies of the Washington Consensus, and it has in the last decade sought with some success to dismantle them. The countries have begun to move towards integration. It's prerequisite independence. And they have begun to address some of the terrible internal problems of societies that are ruled by small, very small, mostly Europeanized, often white elites, tiny islands of extreme wealth and a sea of misery in basically pretty rich countries. They've also almost rid themselves of U.S. military bases and also of IMF controls. That's pretty spectacular. And the effects are very clear. They were dramatically visible at a hemispheric conference in Colombia a couple of years ago. The conference couldn't reach a consensus, so no declaration was ever put out. And the reason was there were two major issues, and on these issues, the U.S. and Canada refused to go along with the hemisphere, so no consensus. The issues were admission of Cuba into the hemispheric system. U.S. and Canada refused. Everyone else was in favor of it. And the second was the drug war, the U.S. drug war. It's devastated the continent. The problem of the drugs is here, United States primarily. That's the source of demand. It's also the supply of arms. So, the tens of thousands of people who are killed in Mexico, there have been some studies of the arms that were used. The majority of them come from the United States, from the border states, Arizona, Texas. You can walk into a store, pick up an assault rifle, and hand it over to the guy from the cartel who's standing there. That's the source of the problem. Latin America is being severely harmed by it. And on both of these issues, the United States and Canada were isolated in opposition to the rest of the hemisphere. And if there is another hemispheric conference, the two North American countries might simply not even be invited. The traditional, what's called backyard, is no more. That's serious. But even more serious would be the loss of what are called the MENA countries, Middle East, North Africa. The Arab Spring is very far from having achieved the promise that many hoped for, but there were achievements, and it's another development of historic importance, which I'm sure is going to continue, and it might portend loss, so-called, of MENA. The U.S. and its allies have tried very hard to prevent the major threat in the region. That's the threat of democratization. And so far, they've had some success. Their policies towards the popular uprisings have kept very closely to standard guidelines. Support the forces most amenable to U.S. influence. Favored dictators are supported up until the moment when it becomes when they can't maintain control. It's impossible to sustain them any longer. So maybe the army turns against them. Okay, then you have to drop them, send them off to pasture somewhere, and try to restore the old regime. And where you can maintain control under dictatorships, do it. And that's been achieved in the most important places, the major oil states and Bahrain. The general pattern is completely familiar. So I won't run through the detailed examples, but if you think of the record of Somoza, Marcos, Suharto, Mobutu, case after case, support the dictators as long as possible, can't do it any longer, send them off somewhere, try to restore the old regime. It's exactly what was done in Tunisia and Egypt with varying degrees of success. One case was a little different, Libya. There, the three traditional imperial powers, France, England, and the United States, virtually alone, and without world support, often powerful opposition. Most powerful opposition actually was in Africa. Libya is an African state. The African Union had positions. They were calling for negotiations to try to avoid the humanitarian catastrophe that was likely to result, and indeed did result, from intervention. But the three imperial powers didn't want that. They wanted intervention. They achieved it. They participated in a rebellion to overthrow a kind of a difficult character, an unreliable dictator, and they opened the way, it's hoped at least, to potential control over Libya's extensive oil resources, and also to a possible base for the U.S. Africa Command, and quite significantly, to reversal of Chinese penetration in Libya. There were tens of thousands of Chinese technicians and others who had to withdraw. And there's a consequence. The consequence is that Libya, apart from the killings and so on, Libya's been left in the hands of rival militias fighting turf battles, pretty severe enough to have almost totally curtailed the export of oil, production of oil on which the economy relies. Meanwhile, the Syrian horror story continues, plunged towards suicide. If you look over the whole region, there have been few surprises. Very crucially for Western powers, it's important to try to reduce the threat of democracy. Of course, they plead commitment to democracy all the time, but everybody says that. It's meaningless. Even Stalin said it. The words are meaningless. You have to look at the policies. And there's a very good reason why the U.S. and its allies strongly oppose democracy in the region. Very simple reason. You can figure it out easily. There are extensive polls of public opinion in the Arab world taken by the major U.S. and other Western polling agencies. And they're pretty consistent over time. So, for example, right on the eve of the Tahrir Square uprising in Egypt, February 2011, there was a major U.S. poll of Egyptian public opinion. They found that although Egyptians strongly dislike Iran, most of the Arabs do, it's old hostilities, they don't regard Iran as a threat. Only a few percent regarded Iran as a threat. They do regard other countries as threats, the United States and Israel. Overwhelming majorities regard them as the threats. In fact, such a severe threat that back at that time, a majority of Egyptians actually favored they hoped that Iran would develop nuclear weapons as a counterpart, as a counterweight to the real threat that they face, the U.S. and Israel. There are similar results throughout the region, varying slightly, but roughly like that in polls consistently. So, of course, it's natural, necessary to try to block democracy. Democracy means that public opinion will influence policy. We certainly don't want those ideas to become policy, So opposition to democracy in the MENA countries is the same as opposition to democracy at home. You don't want public opinion to influence policy. Well, there's a lot more to say about the region, particularly about Israel and Iran, which are the leading concerns of policy, but no time to go into that. Other critical topics should be looked at are the growing role of China and India in world affairs. It's real, but you shouldn't fall prey to illusions about the potential global power of these countries. They're very poor countries. They face enormous internal problems unknown in the West. And for the foreseeable future, at least, there's no challenge to U.S. global domination, even though it continues to erode to a large extent under self-inflicted blows. That became particularly evident in the last few weeks during this strange farce in Washington. It astonished most of the world. It astonished and frightened even the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. There was one commentator in the Chinese press who captured the general mood. He said that unless the United States learns how to behave like a responsible adult, a sensible participant in global order, and that incidentally is not asking much, but unless the U.S. can reach that stage, then he said the world will have to become de-Americanized. It'll have to separate itself from the erratic rogue state that's the hegemonic military power, but is losing whatever other credibility it might have. Actually, that's not an entirely novel observation. You go back to, say, the late 90s, the professor of what was called the science of government at Harvard, notable liberal intellectual Samuel Huntington, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, main establishment journal, in which he said that, this is 1999, he said that in the eyes of much of the world, he suggests probably most of the world, the United States is becoming the rogue superpower, considered the single greatest threat to their societies. And he warned that this is not a good idea. He had pragmatic objections. Counterforces will develop. It's pretty much as the Chinese spokesman observed a couple of weeks ago. Well, just how far this self-inflicted decline will proceed, it's not entirely clear. It's a matter of intense concern to the corporate sector and to the Republican establishment. You've been reading that in the business press in the last couple of weeks. They can barely manage to control the extremist forces that they mobilized as a kind of a battering ram to carry the neoliberal assault further. They can't control them. There are similar questions elsewhere. Europe's policies of austerity under recession are so destructive that they actually make the U.S. look progressive in comparison. It's not a joke. By now, they're even eliciting criticism from the IMF. Well, these are among many significant developments, to some extent imponderables, that really do merit close study. But it's not enough it's important to study them and understand them, but of course we all know that's not enough. It's not enough to just observe the world, but also to act to change it, to remedy its severe ills. Paraphrase Marx. That's the commitment of the journal, and I know of all of you. Thanks.